Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost. Amen. Direct, O Lord, all our actions by thy holy inspirations, and carry them on by thy gracious assistance, so that every prayer and work of ours may begin from thee and by thee, be happily and through Christ our Lord. Amen. Mary, seat of wisdom, pray for us. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. The topic of this conference is actually evolution and its connection to the culture of death. And so there's a few transitions we need to make before we actually get to the discussion of the culture of death. And that's going to require a bit of philosophical background. You'll have to forgive me, my doctorate's in philosophy, so I'll try and keep it at a level that's somewhat coherent and understandable to the average person. St. Thomas Aquinas, throughout his corpus, talks about, in the creation of things, he talks about two particular different aspects of it. The first is the actual creation, which is bringing something from nothing into existence. So there's nothing before, and then immediately there is something. And then, of course, there is, as we know in the book of Genesis, there's a series of creations of individual species or essences, different birds, animals, plants, etc., throughout the process, and then eventually there's the creation of man. So there's the actual creation, and then there's the preservation of the thing in being. What does that mean? It means that when God causes something, that thing still depends on God for its existence. It's very similar to if I take a pen and I lift it up off the ground. If I let loose of it, it doesn't stay hovering, right? It'll immediately fall back to the ground. Well, the same thing happens in relationship to existence. We're nothing, in a certain sense. God creates us, and then he gives us existence. That's the creation part of it. And then he has to maintain that existence. Otherwise, if he retracts his causation, the philosophers call that annihilation. The thing will immediately go out of existence. So that's what the structure of the metaphysics, and this is something that the theologians and the philosophers throughout the entire history of the church after St. Thomas signed off on this, the doctrine, the doctrine of preservation of being, basically, or conservation of being, that actually God actually has to maintain the thing in existence, otherwise it will stop to exist. What happens is after St. Thomas, there's a breakdown in philosophy with nominalism and rationalism and then empiricism, but there's a series of breakdowns in philosophy to where the metaphysics, now metaphysics isn't when you go to the Barnes and Nobles, every time I see that I cringe. I go into Barnes and Nobles and they'll have a metaphysical section, and it's basically all the witchcraft books and New Age stuff. And that's not at all. Metaphysics just means things that are beyond the physical, but we're actually talking about considerations. Physical things can actually be part of the consideration of metaphysics, but it's a consideration above and beyond the thing purely as physical. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that in discussing the causes of things, that is, God being the cause of things and things' existence and that type of thing, that's something that's above and beyond the consideration of the thing's actual physicality, the fact that it's a material thing, the fact that it's here, etc., that it has these particular qualities or characteristics. It's something that's above and beyond that, and that's why it's called meta, which means beyond. It's beyond the physics, which comes from the Greek word physis, which means nature. So it's something that's a consideration beyond that. What happens is through a series of breakdowns philosophically, there is a destruction of the understanding of metaphysics, and in that process, the metaphysics, part of the discussion of metaphysics is this very idea that God, when he creates a thing, because it's going from nothing to something, which is an infinite gap, only God can cause that. And as a result of that, then God has to maintain the thing in being. That all collapses. So by the time you get to the 17th and 18th centuries, when the groundwork is starting to be laid for evolution, the whole metaphysics, at least in, not necessarily in the church, because most of the people in the church were following at least some semblance of Thomistic metaphysics, but outside the church there was a wholesale collapse of philosophy along that line. So then what happens is, in the context of that, there's a philosophical idea that came about just called naturalism. And basically naturalism is that you ultimately don't have to have an appeal to God as the cause of things, that the explanation for all the things that exist in the world now can be explained purely within nature itself. Purely within nature itself, rather than the understanding of the philosophers from Aristotle on, is that there comes a certain point when you're looking at nature, you begin to realize it can't account for itself. You've got to go outside of it to give some type of explanation for why this thing is the way it is. So naturalism starts to come along to where they start asserting that the explanation for things are purely internal to nature. And then about that same time, a philosophy called deism begins to be started. Now, deism basically holds there's a God, but he just started creation. He just created the thing, set it in motion, and then backed away and has actually no causal involvement with it afterwards. So the doctrine of dependence, which we got done talking about, or the conservation of being, where the thing depends on God, all of us depend on God for our existence, that is ignored or denied. And then what's set in motion is that God creates this thing, sets it in motion. That motion has a particular trajectory. That's where the evolutionists are going to pick up on, and they're going to try and give form to that trajectory. And then it just starts to progress on its own, and God doesn't have anything to do with it. And so, in a certain sense, even though the world is created by God, the world is essentially godless in the process. Then, that change, that God setting it in motion, then you have a guy come along named Hegel. Now, Hegel says that everything is constantly changing, and it can't help but constantly change. Now, this introduces something that's very key. In addition to the fact that things are constantly changing, and so we can never preserve anything, and this actually becomes a huge problem in the church in the nature of tradition, where they just say, well, even the tradition is constantly changing, so what we have now as a tradition, it bears very little resemblance to what the tradition started out to be, and so really the tradition becomes ignored. But in this particular case, it becomes a problem in relationship to the natures of things. St. Thomas said that in God are all of the ideas in relationship that pertain to the essences or the natures of things. In other words, God has in his mind the natures of every single thing that exists. And these natures, because they're in the mind of God, they're part of what they call the eternal law, and so they never change. Catholics believe this because we know human nature does not change. We have fallen human nature, but human nature doesn't change. What it means to be a dog doesn't change. What it means to be a cat doesn't change. What it means to be a plant doesn't change. What only changes are the various accidental qualities of a particular existing thing. So the fact that you see me here talking, you see me changing, right? As I'm talking, but I don't cease being who I am, and my human nature doesn't change. You've probably heard them talk in the context of technology that eventually human beings will evolve to the point where we'll become human-machine hybrids, cyborgs, and eventually will evolve out of our bodies, etc. This is all based on the idea that the essences or natures of things don't change. When Hegel comes along and says everything has to change, and when God is removed from the process, the upshot of that is that there's no essential structure or nature to anything because it's always changing. And so this is one of the reasons why scientists are having a hard time determining what is even a species. Because a species is just another name for the nature of a thing. They're having a hard time. I mean, basically, they just say, well, there's no real species. It's just one thing changing into another. Okay. Then enter the evolutionists. My point here is not to enter into an ad hominem argument. Now, an ad hominem argument is where the person is presented an argument and you just attack the individual so that you don't actually have to deal with their argument. We'll deal with their argument in a little bit here, the evolutionists, at least in relationship to theistic evolution. If you want to read more than you'd care to about the philosophical problems with evolution, you can read my book, Metaphysics of Evolution. But the point being is that when we have to talk about the motivation behind why there is such a systemic push to maintain evolutionary theory in every facet of culture, why that is the case. Okay. So my intention is not to attack these men on hominum, it's just to lay out the rationale, why this is actually happening. The first is that many of those who are evolutionists, such as James Hutton, Charles Darwin, Charles Lyell, were deists. They didn't believe God actually had an involvement in creation, that he just created the thing, set it in motion, and so there was this evolutionary process. Evolution is just the name for this motion that's occurring in relationship to creation. Okay. So we said that deism is a philosophical system which simply holds there's a God, but that God has no involvement in or interaction with what he has created. James Hutton thought that the mechanism allowed the species various species to form varieties better adapted to particular conditions and provided evidence of benevolent design in nature. In other words, God set the thing in motion, doesn't have anything to do with it, but it is kind of evolving according to a specific trajectory. Charles Darwin, in his own words, says, in The Origin of Species, "When thus reflecting, I feel compelled to look to a first cause having an intelligent mind in some degree analogous to that of man, and I deserve to be called a theist." Okay, so he says I'm a theist, and deists actually believe there's a God, so they're theists in that sense. But then he goes on to say, he says, "I have never been an atheist in the sense of denying the existence of God." Part of this has to do with any kind of person that was intellectually respectable in that day and age wouldn't be an atheist, right? So there is a tendency among some philosophers to maintain a certain respectability within their community so that they don't just get rejected and their theories don't get rejected. He says, he thinks rather, that, quote, "generally, and as I more and more grow older," he says, "an agnostic would be the most correct description of my state of mind," unquote. Well, this makes sense. If you're a deist, God starts the thing into existence. He has no interaction. So you're not going to be certain about whether the interactions or what's actually occurring in reality reflects God in any way whatsoever. Whereas if he's always preserving the thing in being, he's intimately involved. And so there's a philosophical principle which states the cause is always some way in the effect. So when God causes something, he reveals something about himself in the effect. We know this to be true. God created us in his image and likeness, which means what? If you look at human beings, they have intelligence and free will, and that reflects God in some manner, because God has intelligence and free will. But because God has no interaction, ultimately, you can't be sure if the actual state of this thing has any reflection upon God whatsoever. So in the end, he basically becomes somewhat of a deist. We also know this about Charles Lyell. We also know this about Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who was also heavily influential in the evolutionary theory. Many of those who were proponents of evolution were also Freemasons. Now, Freemasonry has been systematically condemned by the church. It's an evil organization from the top to the bottom. There's nothing beneficial about the thing to culture or to society in any manner whatsoever. I say that as an exorcist, as well as somebody who's just studied the thing from the outside. But why am I going into this? There's a key reason, and it gets to this whole reason why there's such a push for it. First, the Freemasons, it's not clear that Darwin himself was actually a Freemason. His father, Erasmus, was a Freemason. That is clear, because he's actually on the lodge rolls. Charles Darwin does not appear on any of the rolls, but his mindset reflects a Freemasonic mindset, which is essentially Gnostic, which we're going to return to here in just when we talk about the principle of the integral good. So, but Erasmus Darwin was actually part of the Tyrian Lodge at Derby. He was made there in sometime between 1807 and 1808. He wrote a book called Zoonomia, in which he wrote, quote, "It would be too bold to imagine that in the great length of time." Now, in one of the biggest things that they do in evolution, this is a big tip. whenever they can't account for the proper causes of how one thing became another, like in punctuated equilibrium or things of that sort, or even in just the whole the whole process, they can't come up with all the causes that would actually explain how we got where we're at through an evolutionary cause. They always throw time in there as a solution. Well, given enough time, then eventually it'll happen. Given enough time, this would actually occur. It's the same argument if you had an infinite number of monkeys type on an infinite number of typewriters, they would eventually produce the Bible. It's that kind of argument, right? So the point being is that if their attitude is if you just give enough time, eventually this would happen. Actually, that's not the case. If God does not impose structure on the order of reality, then it essentially means that things are random. So it's not the case that when you go from one possible set of random possibilities or circumstances, and then there's another set of random, that eventually you're going to eliminate all the random and eventually you're going to end up with that thing. No, what you end up is an exponential number of random things, so it becomes even more random. So the explanation is actually the opposite of what they're purporting. So time doesn't solve anything in the process of explaining why creation is at the current state that it's in now. Okay. So he said, it would be too bold to imagine that in the great length of time since the earth began to exist, perhaps, so he's not even arguing to the existence of this. And this is one of the things that's about evolution. It's supposition after supposition after supposition. Even their stratification theories in which they say, well, here we see that there's, that in this point we know that there were sea creatures and then eventually they got on land and then they got on this, which by the way, there's an actual different explanation for that. It's that when there's a flood, the first thing that dies is the stuff on the bottom, which is the sea stuff. Then it's the stuff that's on the lower, closer to the edge to the water line. And then there's, of course, the stuff that's on the top, which is larger. So there's actually an explanation. There's a phenomenal YouTube video by a Protestant, of all things, on the internet in relationship to that. Perhaps it'd be too bold to imagine that a great length of time since the earth began to exist, perhaps millions of ages before the commencements of the history of mankind. So he's already speculating. What he speculates becomes dogma now. Would be too bold to imagine that all warm-blooded animals have arisen from one living filament, the great first cause endowed with animality, with the power of acquiring new parts, attended with new propensities, directed by irritations, sensations, volitions, and associations. So he's basically trying to lay the groundwork for just, it's a philosophical speculation. Let's be clear about that. Evolution has very little to do with empirical science. It has primarily to do with philosophical presuppositions. And when you start getting to them, and part of this we actually know to be the case, because the minute they interject time, well, time would show all of this. That's a philosophical statement. Historically, even if you take all the science that you can, you don't have enough time to prove anything that there's actually any change of one species into another time-wise. So you have to speculate. So it's a speculation. With the power of acquiring new parts, attended with new propensities, etc., and thus possessing the faculty of continuing to improve by its own inherent activity. That's the naturalism. The explanation for the evolution to higher things is based upon what's internally to the thing. And of delivering down those improvements by generation to its prosperity, world without end. I suppose we're supposed to say amen. All right. Two things of import. The first is that the first cause endowed creation with the power of acquiring new parts and basically building on itself in such a way that it actually develop or evolve, we may say, in the end, this is just naturalism. That's all this is. We begin to see where Charles Darwin got his idea. So this Zoonomia, which I just quoted, is actually from his father. And so there's a certain side of Charles that's trying to justify his father, Erasmus. In the same text, he says there is a similar survival of the fittest, okay, in which a species should propagate itself. So this is one of the key things in philosophy, and actually it's true in every science. Precision is everything, right? When you listen to people talk, especially when you get on the blogs and the forums and people are typing stuff in, the lack of precision in people's thinking is appalling. right? They just throw stuff out, which is all sorts of logical fallacies and stuff are in the process, and they think they're being intelligent in that process, right? But this is the whole thing about, if you read precisely Darwin, in the end, Darwin wasn't even sure of his own theory. In fact, at one point, he even said that if they find a particular thing, it's the end of my theory, which they found. So the point being is that he himself, if you pay close attention to the way he wrote, he was proposing this to try, and it's like anything else, well, maybe it's this. And then the next thing you know, everyone's saying it's this, right? Instead of the maybe gets dropped. Okay. So it should propagate itself. It was Erasmus's idea, his father's idea, that the strongest and the most active animal would propagate the species, which would thence become improved. We actually know that's not the case in nature, necessarily. Charles Darwin and his father and his grandfather were Freemasons, so even if he wasn't a Freemason, his upbringing was heavily influenced by it. James Hutton was a Freemason and attended Canongate Lodge, the oldest Freemasonic chapel in the world. So he was there. Why do Freemasons want evolution? Why is it that there's this connection? If you've ever been to the airport in Denver, this connection comes out in spades. You can walk into, right before you enter into the, entering into the TSA security section, there is the cornerstone, and it's a Freemasonic lodge stone. The whole thing is about the Freemasons, the Grand Master, and such did this, that, and on such and such a date, etc. The entire flooring in most of the concourses has individual species stuff. It's all about evolution. The whole thing is about evolution. The whole, so there's the Freemasonic stuff, and they're the ones who dedicate it, and then you have this. Of course, the big joke is, among us exorcists, is when you drive in, they have this blue Mustang with red eyes, and the name of it's Blucifer. And now, we can laugh about it, but it actually fell down and crushed its own creator. It killed him. Okay, why do Freemasons want evolution? Okay. The 33rd degree Supreme Council of Mizraim, Freemasonry at Paris, has the following entry in its minutes. Okay. Quote, "It is with this objective in view," now they're talking about the scientific theory of evolution. "It is with this objective in view that we are constantly, by means of our press, arousing a blind confidence in these theories." They don't even believe it themselves. I think what that means, the Freemasons who are pushing this don't even believe this themselves. The intellectuals will puff themselves up with their knowledge, and without any logical verification of them, will put into effect all the information available from science, which our agentur specialists, agentur just means the person activating stuff and getting it going, have cunningly pieced together for the purpose of educating their minds in the direction we want. They just admit it. We don't believe any of this, but we're going to use it to our ends to further the ends of Freemasonry in culture. Do not suppose for a moment that these statements are empty words. Think carefully of the successes we arranged for Darwinism. They were the ones who started the process of promoting it. In effect, the reason the Freemasons pushed Darwinianism is for the sake of social engineering. That's why they do it. It's the social engineering side of it that is why they push it so hard and they make use of it. In fact, we know this because of a few things. One, the communists, which is basically the brainchild of the Freemasons, grab onto this and make ample use of it. Karl Marx saw in Darwin as providing the death blow to traditional religion. Why? Because if there's evolution, then the first 3 books of Genesis are false or myth. And if that's the case, then the entire foundation of the Christian religion collapses. Because why? Christ came precisely to invert what happened at the fall. It's because of original sin and all the actual sin that follows from that he comes and redeems us. And if there's no original sin, then there's no need for a redeemer. We just have to look for the natural causes to improve our lives and make it better. Stalin, by the way, who was in a Catholic seminary at one point, lost his faith when he read Darwin. In China, the Red Army, when it would come into town, they still do this, by the way. They force everybody in the town to listen to lessons on Darwinism, and in order to put an end to religious belief in the communities. So it's a form of social engineering. This is why they actually do it. The humanists, who then actually adopt Darwinism, of course, they end up gaining control of the National Education Association, and so do the communists. If you read Bella Dodd's School of Darkness, this is not conspiracy theory. This is actual annotated, this person did that and this person did this. They gained control over the communists, again, which is the brainchild of Freemasonry, gained control of the National Education Association, and as a result of that, that's why in education today, evolution is dogma. It is taught, it is constant. Anything that has to do with religion, anything that has to do with creation accounts or anything like that is poo-pooed as pseudoscientific or silly or mythological or fairy tales, and that's what we believe, when in point in fact, evolution is the fairy tale that's under the guise of science. And in fact, the scientists, the more you read the scientists, the upper level scientists, the guys at the top echelon of science in all the various departments, don't buy evolution at all. It doesn't fulfill the second law of thermodynamics. It doesn't fit the genetics, especially when they found out about genetic entropy. Once that occurred, it was the death knell of Darwinism and evolution, at least genetically. And so, but it's the middle tier that was basically trained by the communists, inculcated by the communists, in this evolution that is keeping and maintaining this stuff in place. Evolution then, so evolution gets into the various departments. It becomes very influential in the secular world. From that then becomes a particular set of problems. Once there is no God, that means God's not creating a human soul and infusing it in the body. He's just started this thing and letting it go, which basically means that man is just an animal, right, which is developing with everybody else. We just happen to be at the end of the evolutionary scale in some fashion, although some people think that we're actually below animals in some way. You know, it'd be better if human beings weren't on the planet, that kind of a thing. Which actually, as an exorcist, that just reminds me of the way the demons talk, right? Would have been better if human beings never would have been created, type of thing. Okay, so, but the point is that once that trajectory happens and things are evolving, then you have to look to nature to provide the answer for our problems. And that means you have to start working with nature and manipulate nature to produce better human beings. Enter eugenics. We all know that Margaret Sanger was a eugenicist. This is why, when she started, was it the American Eugenics Society? Is that what this is called? Yeah, well, she started several of them, but one of them was originally the eugenics. The problem with the eugenics thing is that it was picked up by the Nazis, who, by the way, got it from us in the United States. The eugenic laws in the United States, when Hitler read about them, he loved them, because they fit his whole idea of Germany, the Germans being the master race, and then everyone else is subpar. We can make use of some of them, but some of them we have to eradicate, etc. But that same mindset is still there, but he got that from the eugenic laws and from the eugenicists in the United States. Then the eugenicists, basically their theory is, of course, that we have to improve our breeding stock, basically treating people like cattle. And so that means we're going to have to eliminate certain undesirables from culture, from the planet ultimately. We need to eliminate them so that we can actually have a better culture, better society. We can actually have improved health and things of that sort through this evolvement that we will have in relationship to it through eugenics. Once Hitler adopts eugenics and then there is the Holocaust, eugenics gets a bad name, and then that's why they changed their name to Planned Parenthood, and things of that sort. The mindset is still the same. I think I read a statistic, it's like 78 or 80% of all Planned Parenthoods are located in minority ethnic areas. The eugenics is still going on. Fortunately, the Afro-Americans or the blacks are actually figuring this out, that this is genocide. They're trying to wipe out the blacks and the minorities. That's actually why it's actually there, right? So abortion then ends up becoming this basically a form of eugenics in the end. Now, we do provide it to white people, etc., but that's only kind of the side effect. It's a part of this whole social engineering. Plus, things are going to evolve. We're seeing that even in the discussion of gay marriage, right? Oh, well, we've evolved past this idea that marriage is between one man and one woman, and so therefore it's, anybody who loves each other, they can actually, then we're fine. So there's this evolution. Our Lady said at Quito, Ecuador, that the Freemasons would seek to destroy marriage in the latter part of the 19th and 20th centuries, which are doing a phenomenal job. Everywhere there are Freemasons, they still push the same social engineering, but part of that is, and I don't mean to pin everything on the Freemasons, because this thing has kind of taken on a life of its own at this stage. But everywhere they're at, in every single culture they're at, in every single country where they gain ascendancy, abortion is always introduced. So what does this mean? That they use evolution to do the social engineering in order to produce a culture of death. A culture of death is basically just one in which people are murdering and killing innocent people and people that don't deserve to be put to death, as John Paul II rightly pointed out, which quite frankly was a stroke of genius to see that from a global kind of perspective, that we're living in a culture of death where basically people are willing to kill each other in order to, or their own children in order to gain a certain better life for themselves, etc. And so evolution goes through this process, or evolution is this process, it's the social engineering used in order to destroy any semblance of God creating man directly. Man is just the product of these evolutionary things. Therefore, because he's only an animal, you can, technically speaking, like any other animal, put him to death and there's no moral crime involved. And it's better to improve the general lot of us all if we remove the desirables, those who are genetically unfit, and then we just actually produce this genetically pure race and society. And then we can also, through that genetic manipulation, remove bad behaviors through the genetic manipulations, because ultimately, since we're just animals, all this bad behavior is just the product of bad genes. So we just have to get rid of all this, and then we'll have this ideal utopic society in the end. That's the mindset. So that's one of the real dangers. This is one of the reasons why the church is going to have to wrestle with evolution in some manner. Now, we know through the Fourth Lateran Council that the church actually defined, using the word simul, that God created the totality of creation in a short period of time. It wasn't until the advent of evolution made its way into, which, by the way, in the very beginning, before modernism set in the Catholic Church, the Catholic theologians were hammering evolution, hammering it, dissecting it philosophically, theologically, etc. But they just only did that for a brief period of time, but then modernism got its way in, and modernism, which adopts the Hegelian dialectic, that things are always changing, adopted evolution. They also adopted it in order to destroy the credibility of Scripture. That's one of the primary things. So if you look at what the modernists did, the first thing they did is destroyed the credibility of Scripture by denying Genesis and adopting evolution. They then denied the scriptural accounts by saying that, well, God doesn't get involved, really, and so all these miracles are just people thinking they are, etc. These are just myths, or these are the product of later scriptural writers, etc., rather than the entire tradition of the church says that all gospels were written by the year 95 by the actual apostles or the people who heard it directly from them. So this is, that gets all denied, so scripture gets destroyed. The next thing that gets destroyed is ecclesiology, that is our theological understanding of the church, which I'm going to talk about here in a minute. And then after that, the implosion of the natural law. The natural law tells us what the moral code is. So this is the progression. Obviously, it's going to have to be inverted. I do think that John Paul II and Benedict to some degree, but John Paul II is working hard to reverse the effects of the collapse of the natural law. The ecclesiology has yet to be addressed yet, because there's some key problems there. But then the last one, the real juggernaut, is going to be getting Scripture reestablished. And basically all that means we just have to go back to the tradition, to the fathers, especially St. Augustine in his discussion about divine inspiration and how it functions and how it works. Okay. But if the church doesn't address this, it's never going to be able to address the real problem of abortion. Now, part of this has to do with the fact that abortion is merely the effect of the spirit of fornication. I find it interesting that it's right, I mentioned this last night at my conference, that it's at the same time that they actually, that the church removed from the spirit of fornication, deliver us, O Lord, from the litany of saints. It's right at that same time that the free love movement started. Very interesting. Prayer begets what it signifies. What you ask for is what you get. Christ said, knock and you'll receive. So if you knock, or it'll be open. So if you ask, if you stop asking, you're not going to get it, right? So this is something that the church is really going to have to address, but it's going to have to address this issue of evolution if it's ever going to really be able to conquer the problem of the culture of death, and that's the only way that it's going to be able to do that. This brings up, then, the problem of, because a lot of Catholics even heard this, you're seeing it kind of defended here and there, because a lot of Catholic theologians and philosophers are starting to take a hard look at this and are starting to think, and a scientific look and say, there's just not the support scientifically for evolution. And so they're starting to take a serious look at this thing and say this is a problem. But what happens is because this social engineering has occurred, in order to be considered a reliable or an authentic or a credible scientific source or a scientist or a theologian or philosopher, you have to sign off on evolution in some form. Otherwise, you're going to be dismissed and you are not going to be considered credible. And so a lot of Catholics are trying to reconcile this. In fact, just recently, there was somebody who wrote a thing that tried to reconcile St. Thomas and evolution, and in the end, it just doesn't fit or work. He ends up having to deny all sorts of things in St. Thomas in order to be able to do so. But in fact, one French theologian actually finally did look at St. Thomas, and in the end, he comes out and he just says, look, if you're really going to be a Thomist, you can't be an evolutionist, right? So at least they did that. But what happens is now they want to have evolution in some way. So one of the criticisms of evolution is based upon the principle of sufficient reason. And the principle of sufficient reason states this. I'll give you the formal definition, and then we'll talk about what it really means. Okay. The existence of a thing is accountable either in itself or in another. Okay, what does that mean colloquially? It means you can't give what you don't have. If I don't have $1 million, I can't give you $1 million. If I don't have eyeballs, I can't give you eyeballs, right? So in evolution, there's a basic principle that's part of that branches off from that. It's called the principle of not the principle of nature, it's the principle of continuity of nature. So basically what that means is this: like begets like. A dog is going to beget a dog. It's not going to beget a cat, and it's not going to beget an ape or something like that. It can only give what it has, and genetically, it doesn't have it. Even from if there's other outside factors, those things coming together still don't produce a higher thing. What they produce is a lower modified thing. That's what they're discovering in real scientific studies. Okay. So what happens is the theistic evolutionists who want to say, well, we have to believe in everybody who's credible has to believe in evolution, and therefore we've got to get God worked in this because nature can't go from a lower state to a higher state or from a less organized state to a more organized state unless there is something added from the outside, and therefore God we bring God in. It's the Deus Ex Machina thing. You backed yourself into a corner, so now you got to bring in God to solve the problem, right? So, and that's what they basically do. They bring God in. Well, basically, at each little step, God intervene, and then slowly over the course of time, evolved this thing over the course of millions of years until this point. Well, aside from the fact that this is against the entire tradition of the church, entirely against Scripture, there's two principles that it ends up violating. The first is called the principle of economy. Now, the principle of economy states that the explanation, let me back up. There's two ways it's formulated. Don't multiply causes without sufficient reason. In other words, the explanation, which is the second formulation, the simplest explanation is most likely or is the case. So what this means is that theistic evolution, by introducing God in each and every single instance, has to assert that at every single step in evolution over the course of millions and billions of years, God was constantly introducing miraculous events into nature because it's outside of the powers of nature, constantly doing that little by little over the entire course of the history. That violates the principle of economy, because the principle of economy would say it's much simpler if God just simply creates in a short period of time all the different natures, sets them up in a coherent system, and then starts it off and moves it and maintains it in existence. That's a much more economic explanation of the reality. So it violates the principle of economy. The second principle it violates is the principle of the integral good. Now, the principle of the integral good is something which is virtually destroyed in the life of the church in the last 50 to 60 years. And basically, the principle of the integral good, I'll give you the formulation, and then we'll discuss what it means. The principle of the integral good states that a good is from an integral cause, evil from any defect whatsoever. What does that mean? It means that in order for a thing to become perfect, all the parts that go into making that thing up have to be present and caused. Otherwise, there's a defect, right? We know this from our own personal experience. If you saw someone who had beautiful facial features, but their nose was missing, you wouldn't say they're beautiful, right? Or we know this also even in the moral sphere, right? So it's not morally justifiable to drop a bomb and wipe out 70,000 civilians, of which there are pregnant women involved, and as a result, innocent people die through that process, because the ends don't justify the means. Just because the end is good doesn't mean that murdering people is a legitimate means to getting there. Okay, we know this. So, and we also know this, that a perfect example is if there's a law that says that there's a curfew in place at 10 o'clock, we know that, I'm going to go for a walk. I want to get health. My health, that's the end. I want to build up my health. And so I'm going to go for a walk. That's a good thing. That's the means I'm going to do to get good health. But I'm going to do it at 11 o'clock at night. No, sorry. Just that circumstance makes it bad. We know this with modesty, right? If a couple decides to engage in an act contrary to the Sixth Commandment in public, they might be married. It might be a illicit marital act. But the fact that it's done in a location, in a circumstance that's bad, renders the whole thing bad, right? Okay. We actually know this to be the case. Okay. Now, I want to talk a little bit about ecclesiology before we make the transition to evolution. The Catholic Church states, and the whole tradition of the Church states, that the Catholic Church is the only one that has all four marks, right? It's one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. It's the only one that has that. In fact, the authors pointed out between 1870 and about 1930, because there was a lot of ecclesiology done then because they had just come out of the First Vatican Council in relationship to the definition of papal infallibility, etc. So there was a lot of discussion during that time. And what they pointed out is that the Catholic Church is the only one that has any of the marks in their fullness, any of them in their fullness. Okay. So why is this important? Well, there was a man by the name of Charles Journet who actually quoted another author in piecing this together, but there was a man named Charles Journet in a book called The Church of the Word Incarnate. And in that book, he talks about how Aristotle says there's four causes of a thing. The first is the material cause. That's the thing out of which you make something. So bronze, or let's take the crucifix of our Lord. The silver is that from which his body is formed out of. So it's the silver is the material cause. The formal cause is the shape or the thing that you give, the structure you give to it. So it's actually the form of Christ's body in that silver makes it Christ's body. Okay. Then the efficient cause is the thing that brings it into existence, right? So the artisan is the one who fashioned it, and so he's the one who brought that form into existence in the matter. The final cause is, why did he do it? Well, he's just trying to support himself. Or maybe he loves Christ and he just wants to do a beautiful picture or make a beautiful sculpture for Christ. When we look at the four marks of the church, we discover that they line out with the four causes. The material cause, that out of which the church is made, is the Catholicity. It's all races throughout the world. Those are the people out of which the church is made. The formal cause is the unicity of the church, because it's through actually the papacy, which is the principle of unity, which they defined it at Vatican I. The principle of the papacy is what unifies the church under a single head, and so it's what gives it form in a certain sense. Then the efficient cause is the apostolicity, because it's through the apostolicity, through the bishops and the priests, that people are baptized and brought into the church, and so it's what gives the church existence in that sense. The final cause is the holiness. That's why he made the church. He made the church to make us all holy. All right. Why is that discussion even relevant? It's relevant for this point. Charles Journet points out in the discussion of these four causes, he points out that God, in causing a thing, always acts as an integral cause. What does that mean? It means that whenever God is the direct cause of the existence of a thing, there is never anything lacking in the perfection of that thing when it's finished. The only time, St. Thomas says, that there is a defect introduced into the bringing of a thing into existence is when secondary causes get involved, right? So in other words, us human beings, it's when we get involved that things go bad, right? If we just let God do it, things would be fine, okay? In relationship to the Catholic Church, because God is the direct cause of the Catholic Church, that's why it's the only Catholic Church, the only religion, the only church that has God as an integral cause. All other churches, all other religions do not have God as their sole cause. They have men. Martin Luther, Henry VIII, Muhammad, all these guys were guys who introduced defect into their religion. The Catholic Church is the only one because it has Jesus Christ as its founder. You can even ask Google for that. It'll actually ask who's the founder of the Catholic Church, and it says Jesus Christ. All right. Which you might try sometime. Okay, unless they've changed it. All right. Why is this important? The same thing applies in creation. When God creates a thing, he creates it instantaneously in its perfection. You have to remember, in creation, there are no antecedent secondary causes. And so as a result of that, when he creates something, it comes into its completeness and perfection instantaneously. This is why when he, even in the creation of the material order, he has to start laying the groundwork. He creates the earth, creates the sun, he creates the various things. Then once that's there, then he can put animals there. So then he creates the animals, he does these things. And each one of these are perfect in their totality, in their nature. So there's two aspects of the principle of the integral good that apply here. The first is that each individual species is perfect in its creation by God. The second is that the total system, this is why God said he looked back and saw that it was good, is good and perfect. There's nothing lacking. Theistic evolution has to essentially say that God created something in a state of imperfection, that his causation was imperfect without an antecedent secondary cause, which violates the principle of the integral good. They have to assert that, and then they have to say that he uses death as an intrinsic mechanism in order to achieve what he is trying to achieve, as an intrinsic mechanism. Historically, there are two periods where death enters into the world. St. Thomas says that God creates the world, He creates the various animals, but they're in a state where they're not feeding yet, they're not doing anything because providence hasn't kicked in yet. We're still in the process of creation. This happens in a very short period of time, like a week or so, which Scripture points out. After the week is completed, then it sets in motion. The only death at that point that the theologians said was a part of it, and this is why Adam and Eve had a sense of it in addition to the fact that they had infused knowledge, is because they were eating from the plants. And so there was death in relationship to the particular fruit, not to the totality of the plant, but to the fruit or what have you. And animals were eating plants, and so they had some semblance of death. So there's natural death, but only in relationship to plants. Death doesn't enter into human race or into actually the animal life, according to Scripture and according to the teaching of the Church, actually St. Paul, etc., until man commits sin. Before then, everything is integrally good. And even the plants being consumed, they're actually entering into a higher state by being consumed and brought into a higher being, and so it's actually a good thing, right, by its very nature. It's only after man, the secondary cause, gets involved that things start to decline. And so theistic evolution violates the principle of economy. It violates the principle of the integral good, both in relationship to the individual species and the total system. And as a result of that, it's an unsustainable thing from a philosophical point of view. So, that all being said, the part of the other difficulty is if death is an intrinsic part of the world and is not the product of sin, then it's hard for us to say that, killing babies is necessarily a bad thing, right? If it's an intrinsic part of the world, especially if it's all a natural system. But even in theistic evolution, they're trying to provide, get the deus ex machina thing, they're trying to provide, get God in there to provide for everything so that they can account for something, and all you're trying to do is propping up a failing system, even on a scientific level. Okay. We'll stop there. I realized that was a bit of a load. So we'll stop there and then resume in the Q&A. First question. Yes.
Things here tonight that debunks evolution, but early on in the discussion you mentioned something about the one thing regarding Charles Darwin.
Yeah.
And I wanted to, I don't know if I just missed it or if you kind of passed over it. What was the one thing?
If they don't ever find any transitions in the fossil record, which they never did. They've only found complete species in the fossil record. They've actually never found the transitions. What they do is they take various things and they put them together and say, well, this is the transition. No, the actual transition would be something in the process of morphing in the fossil record. So.
You mentioned, this is not evolution, that someone had written said that only the Catholic Church had any of the four marks? Or all of the four marks?
No. Well, the Catholic Church is the only one that has all four marks.
All four. Okay.
Some of the other religions have some of the marks,
Okay,
but they don't have, none of them have any of the marks in their totality. So, for example, the Catholic Church is the only religion that's universal. It's Catholic. It has races from every race and nation, right? The Catholic Church is the only one actually that has all of the elements of sanctification, which is part of the holiness. So that's why. That would be an example. I knew that it was time to end the conference when people start doing the drooling and just kind of like. Yeah.
I'm kind of interested to see, with all the things that you talked about tonight and this being the foundation for social manipulation.
Yeah, engineering.
So where does the introduction of where humans are now introducing chimera species come into this discussion? Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, I am. I think it ultimately comes. I think it ultimately comes. You're talking about chimera in the sense that they want to start genetically manipulating things, like through CRISPR and that. Yeah, yeah, right. I think what it is well, there's two elements to it. One is to better understand how these things work, but then also to be able to produce things that we find useful. Like a dog that happens to have a pig's face on it. Because they literally said with CRISPR, they can literally chop it and paste it that way. So, but I think that what we're going to really see with CRISPR is two things. The first is massive genetic, a lot more GMOs in areas where they're able to produce very specific qualities out of things in a much faster and much easier rate, and in a much. And I think that they're going to be able to do it without having to introduce stuff that's more foreign, because some of the GMOs actually have like gold that's introduced into certain parts of the genetic structure and stuff like that. Instead, they'll just use this particular thing has this quality, so let's take these genes from it and put it in here. So I think you'll see stuff like that. I think you'll see a lot more manipulation of the genetic code across the board, from everything from everything from bacteria all the way to full-blown animals. I think you're going to see a plethora of that stuff happening. You'll also see it using because they've already started. I think it's Britain gave permission to start using CRISPR on human beings, on the human genetic code. So they're going to start seeing that. The other thing you're going to see is it's a matter of time before CRISPR becomes easily understood enough to where it will be analogous to making meth, right? You just have to have a little bit of chemistry understanding and you can cook meth, right?
What I was wondering is if there was some sort of long-term goal here to provide that, we have this theory of evolution that we're trying to use to social engineer, right?
That's right.
Now we've got this additional way of adding to that.
Yeah, they've already been talking. Yeah, they've been talking about that. So what they're going to do is they're going to try and map the human genome's been mapped, but they want to be able to pin specific bad behaviors and certain kinds of things or diseases and stuff to specific parts of the genetic structure and then eliminate them from the human genetic code. And that's their goal. So I think that's exactly what they're after. And they've already been talking about it. So the only problem is that my cousin who has his doctorate in pharmaceutical chemistry said, he says, look, as much as we know about the genetic code, we don't know as much as we'd like to think we know, and there's going to be a lot of bad stuff that's going to happen because they're messing with it, and because they just don't know what they're dealing with, really. So the other side of it is that God actually God built into nature an ability to manipulate the genetic code of certain animals through nature itself, so that the safeguards and the mechanism within nature would be preserved. That's how we end up with purebred dogs, right? So God designed that, but instead human beings want to be able to bypass that process and be able to create things that are just basically impossible within the confines of nature. So the second thing I was going to point is it's just a matter of time before it's going to be understood easily how to do this. You'll be able to buy your CRISPR kit and be able to literally, and it's just a matter of time before some guy restructures the DNA in a bacteria or restructures some virus, and then we've got a gargantuan problem on our hands. So, yeah.
Father, you mentioned Hegel and his thinking.
Yeah.
This might be the topic of a whole other talk, so forgive me if it is, but his thinking and then affecting the church.
Right.
Could you speak to when that kind of became very prevalent in the church and how it's affected the church?
Yeah, actually, there's an article that I wrote that you can actually read if you want to get more details on it. It's just called Operative Points of View. It's right on the internet. You can actually get it right off the internet. But basically what happened is it's in the 1700s. Well, let me just back up just a little bit. After nominalism comes, Descartes comes and he wants to reestablish philosophy on a sure footing. So what he ends up doing is, because our senses end up lying to us, he says, they deceive us because you put the stick in water and it looks like it bends, but we know it doesn't really bend. Well, actually, the senses aren't lying to you. What they're telling you is the light's refracting, right? So, but he says, because the senses are deceiving us, therefore, the senses can't be the foundation for our certitude. So he transposes it to our own thought as the foundation for certitude. Then comes along Hume, who ends up saying this. He says, in causation, when you see a billiard ball hit another billiard ball and it go off, one billiard ball isn't causing the other one to move. It's just called constant conjunction. They just happen, one happens to touch it and it slows down, and the other one just speeds up out of nowhere. So the movement, the existence of the movement, the other one is just, it comes from, you get something from nothing, right? Well, that's just the denial of the principle of sufficient reason. It's irrational, right? Okay, so, and when I was in grad school, we used to say, well, the problem with people like that is you just be taken out and beaten. So that they actually understand that there's a real distinction between being beaten and not being beaten, right? Okay. All right, so, but what that does is, effectively is because one thing doesn't cause another, that truncates what you know or experience internally and what you experience through sensation. So what I'm sensing here, because one thing doesn't cause another, I ultimately don't have access to reality. In the end, so it all gets transposed into my mind. Then Hegel comes along, and Hegel ends up saying that things are constantly changing. And so you take that, the fact that things are constantly changing and the fact that we can't really know reality anyway, you couple those two together, and then basically what that means is that religion becomes a constantly evolving process of our own internal experiences. So in the end, what religion is really about is maximizing your experiences of things rather than getting to the concrete reality of what revelation taught us. And so, that all progression happens, and then of course Kant is the one who kind of, that business of I ultimately don't know reality, as a result of this, Kant was the one who solidified that. So this all happens up to the latter part of the 1700s. At first, it's kind of kept at bay by the church's authority and the philosophers and theologians keeping it at bay, and the Thomism in the church. But that begins to erode and collapse, so that by the time you get to 1832, when Moralivos comes out, it's already in the intelligentsia. It's already there, and it starts to influence the intelligentsia. There's a particular phase from about 1820 or so up until Pius X begins the purging of the seminaries and the Catholic universities. That's the intelligentsia phase where it's developed. It becomes influential in the seminaries, in the Catholic universities. Once he condemns it, and then he starts purging the seminary faculties and university faculties of modernists, it goes underground. Guess where it went? The liturgical movement. So they went into the liturgical movement because why? Well, I can talk about changing the liturgy and making this and changing that because why? There's no heresy involved in changing parts of the liturgy. So they went into there, they hijacked the liturgical movement, and then, but during that phase, it went into an underground phase, and it was still being taught in the seminaries and the universities up until Vatican II, and then it comes out into the public or the external phase. By the time you get to that stage, what most people don't realize, by the time you get to Vatican II, the intellectual gas of modernism and the philosophical emptiness of these philosophical systems, the intellectual gas runs out. And so now we end up with this very superficial. In the meantime, in the 1800s, there was this guy named Schleiermacher, and Schleiermacher, because you can't, Kant did two things. One, he cuts you off. So the way we normally know things about God, all 5 proofs of St. Thomas, for example, of God's existence are all based on external reality, right? Well, we're cut off from that, so we can't prove that God exists from external reality. And we can't say that because I have this idea of God, therefore there must be one. Well, St. Thomas already dealt with that and said, well, that doesn't work. Anselm's argument doesn't work. The ontological argument doesn't work, and Kant reiterates that. So Kant then tries to sneak him in through the conscience, but then Kant comes along and says, no, you don't. You can't do that because you don't know if this thing in your mind, coming into your mind, is from God or not. So in the end, once you adopt all this stuff, you end up an atheist. That's what ends up happening. So this atheism then, and the intellectual gas though ends up running out. So what happens is because you can't have any knowledge of whether God exists, there's only one last place that you can have him, and that's in your emotions. And so Schleiermacher says that religion, this is what he says, this is his line, quote, religion is pure emotion, unquote. And so what happens is as the intellectual gas runs out, Schleiermacher comes before, that's the only thing that's left, and so basically what you're left with is let's maximize people's experiences so that they have these emotional highs in relationship to God. And that's what's going on. Yes?
Why are there two creation stories?
You mean in Genesis?
In Genesis, right, like how does that, when you're talking about evolution and...
That's an entire conference on its own, because the fathers of the church talk about different facets of that, and so it's a very broad discussion about what that's supposed to mean. Especially the real one that they talk a lot about is the twofold creation of light. Like, well, wait a minute, if you already created light, why is he creating light again, right? Most of the fathers of the church, in my reading, I mean, it's not by any stretch of the imagination, say that the first creation is the creation of the angels. And then the second creation of light is the creation of the sun. That's what some of them say. So, but in other words, the answer is the fathers are not, they don't have any kind of anonymity about, or unanimity, sorry, in relationship to what the twofold is. There's just different competing theories in relationship to it. Sorry, I didn't answer your question. I just said there's not really an answer. Yeah. Yeah.
From a different angle about creation. The molecular genetics, and I can't give you the philosophical terms that you're using, but you sort of unpacked it a little bit.
Right.
Molecular genetics now is understood to be so complicated that it's actually knocks the legs out.
Right.
And they use the word evolution, but really it would be more appropriate to call it spontaneous generation.
Right.
And at that beginning step, that it's really just not plausible.
Correct.
The complexity of not just the DNA, but all the supporting things.
That's correct. Yeah.
All the protein machinery and
Right.
the RNA and things, that it's just too complicated.
Right.
Statistically imagined and
Correct.
incomplete.
Right. Yeah, well, that's why I mentioned that the science is, the empirical science is, I don't get into it too much, even though I've read a lot of it and I understand it to some degree. I don't get into it because I'm going to end up saying it wrong and someone's going to say father. So, but yeah, that's actually true. The empirical science, though, is showing it's that evolution is unsustainable.
That first step,
Yeah.
and then a miracle occurs kind of thing, like it's not plausible.
Right, exactly. Well, and then the other thing is, too, is the whole thing of genetic entropy, that they actually found out that the genetic mutations are cumulative over the course of time, over the course of the generation. So each generation, it's not like the DNA, it does reset in one sense, but it doesn't reset in the sense that the mutations are excluded. The mutations are added to each subsequent generation, so that in point in fact, we are less genetically pure than Adam and Eve. There was a scientist who started looking at this in brain evolution, in the proper sense, and he said, actually what this means is that the brain is becoming less functional. We're actually dumber than our ancestors, which doesn't take too much to probably agree with that. Right? Just got to look at modern culture and you're like, Yeah. So, yes.
Yeah. I was wondering, this might be a lot off topic, but based on your experience as an exorcist and also the attacks that you're mentioning against the church, I was wondering if you could give some advice to parents trying to raise their children to keep their faith and to be spiritually strong, faithful to the Catholic Church based on your experience. Is there any advice you could give parents?
Yeah, there's two components to it. The first is that you have to raise your children with a thorough knowledge of the Catholic faith. It's not just enough to give them basis catechesis anymore. The second component, and you also have to, in the beginning stages, obviously, you have to give a solid foundation to their intellectual understanding of it. When they get into the 10 to 14 range, there needs to be a deepening of that, but when they get into high school, there needs to be reading of contrary theories, but from the point of view of why they're wrong, so that they actually have that understanding when they actually confront it in culture. The second thing is, that's not enough though. You absolutely have to develop a prayer life within that, consistent prayer life within the family, and in the children a consistent prayer life, because it's through that. It's not just enough to know it, but you have to actually have to will to remain steadfast, and that's where the prayer is going to be helpful. Obviously, as an exorcist, I would say you should also be praying to keep the demons out of your family hair. So, yes.
I was just wondering, with regard to how our culture and education is just so saturated with evolution.
Right.
For example, with regard to the children in school, whether they're homeschooled
Yeah.
or they're in, a good Catholic school, classical
Right.
Catholic school, what have you. If you look through the textbooks,
Oh, yeah, they're all evolutionists.
it's all throughout. So I
Right.
went and actually called some of the homeschool textbook companies to ask them, and I got a total runaround because it's in biology, it's
Right.
in all of that stuff. And when I said, aren't you kind of undermining the faith when you're teaching them the strong faith, but then you go and you teach them evolution?
Right.
There was no answer for that. Do you have a suggestion for what we can do with, whether it's homeschooling or, if someone loves their school and they want to keep them in a Catholic school, is there something they can suggest for them to do?
If you want to keep them in a Catholic school, you're going to fight an uphill battle, because like you said, it's in everything, right? It's in all the textbooks for all the disciplines in every area practically, and so even in the Catholics. So that's why I'm a big fan of homeschooling for more reasons than one. But if you're going to do that, you're going to have to, when the children at home, supplement their catechesis or their religious formation and talk to them about why evolution is actually wrong, and say, yeah, people believe this, and yeah, it's out there, and most people believe it, but it's actually, we know it not to be the case. And you're going to have to give the kids a good formation in why that's the case, because kids aren't stupid. If you just say, oh, we don't believe that, eventually they're going to say, why? If you don't give them something, they're going to get sucked in.
Is there something in the homeschool, that you know of, that is not in the sciences, evolution-based?
There's one that I just heard of. I know nothing about it. I just heard about it, that someone had written a series of books in the sciences without it. But I don't know enough about it. I know the Protestants have written some stuff, but their stuff is so intellectually vapid that you want to just. My recommendation would be actually to talk to the Center for Creation Science and see if they know anybody who would actually know.
Cat Harris organization, is it?
Yeah, that's the one I think I've heard of.
Yeah, we went to the Creation Museum. I was actually gonna.
That's one of them. But there's another one that I think there was one that was put out, or there's some Catholics that were working on one or had one out just initially. It hasn't been out for more than a year or two, I think. Yeah.
I actually homeschool, and we use a curriculum through Seton. It's not Seton's books, but it's Apologia. It's Protestant, but he says this is why evolution doesn't work.
Yeah.
And he gives the different views out there, but lets you decide and shows you the science behind it. He talks you through it. It's very good.
Yeah.
And he uses Bible verses and things to that.
Right. And Mother of Divine Grace also has that. There's actually books, like he has some. There's even a video called No Intelligence Allows. It gives like a really quick, snappy thing for teenagers.
Yeah.
Issues.
It's one of those things that you have to, it's like most homeschooling, right? Where your curriculum has to be pulled together. Yeah.
And there's even a really short, probably one of the most powerful little articles it's like from a little bioethics site in down under that has, its title is something like One to One, an Atheist Nest, and it actually is, again, really good for teenagers. It's just a very a specific thing that has the statistics and things, and it just shoots down the whole evolution. So there are resources out there.
Okay.
Yes.
So would you say that materials from Ken Ham's organization would be okay for our children, especially younger children? Because the Protestants are the only ones who really have anything.
Well, I'll say this. I haven't looked at it closely enough. I've looked at bits and pieces, but I haven't had a chance to review the literature sufficiently well enough to be able to say one way or another. But sometimes what you have to do is you have to find the best stuff that you can, and you yourself review it so that when your kids are looking at it, you can say, okay, look, this is all good, follow this, but this is why this is wrong. in the parts that aren't. Yes.
Start the parents off so we can start learning more to teach our children. Something simple.
Well, if you're looking for something simple, it's because this is a rather complicated issue. There's a book called Time and Creation. It's put out by this Colby Center for Creation Science, which I would recommend as a kind of a starting point, maybe.
What's it called?
Time and Creation. And then, you know, from there, they'll make some recommendations. There's a book called not Storming the Bastions, it's Rebuilding the Bastions or something like that. It's also put out by the Center for Creation Studies. But they talk about concretely ways that can be approached in order to overcome the problem, both culturally and I think, if I remember right, in families, but don't quote me on that. So, but that's where I would probably start. They also have basic articles online that can point you in a lot of good directions. Ironically, the Protestants are the ones that are doing a lot of the work, even in the science. Now, some of their scientific stuff is just goofy. But recently I watched a video on the flood that talks about stratification. It's only about a 15-minute video where they talk about why the fossils are grouped in particular locations and how it pertains to a progressive flood as described in Scripture. So they actually line it out that scientifically what's laid out in Scripture is actually the real only explanation to account for it. So some of the stuff coming out of the Protestants is good. But what I would do is, at least for now, is take a look at some of the stuff from the Center for Creation Science, Colby Center. I mean, I've obviously written stuff, but everybody complains that it's extraordinarily difficult to get through. But anyway, which is okay. Yes.
So has the evolution theory also influenced modern psychology and the treatment of mental illness, as far, you know, even OCD specifically?
Right. It has, but that influence, well, what's happening in the psychological community is that it's actually going through a split right now. What's happening is the traditional schools of psychology have been abandoned, like Freudianism and Jungianism. That's been abandoned for the most part. And so what's happening is there's a twofold split that's actually happening. There's a sizable segment that is actually basically accepting that cultures change and what constitutes mental health changes, and so it's evolving, and so they're just trying to quantify that and get a sense of what that is. But in the end, they end up accepting things like homosexuality is acceptable, or it's psychologically healthy behavior and things of that sort. So there's a group that's heading down that path. That tends to be kind of the low-level people. The people that are really doing the hard psychological sciences have basically chucked pretty much everything. It happened in the mid to late 90s. They just started, you know, getting rid of the schools, getting rid of the philosophical presuppositions. Let's just look to see what's going on. And so they're slowly but surely, that coupled with the advances in brain science, those two things coming together, they're actually starting to come up with some things that are somewhat sound. Because they're just realizing, well, the person who does this, they break it down, they realize this doesn't work. So it's kind of going in that direction. That's not really necessarily a form of evolution, but the other path is. So probably a bit more than you were expecting to hear, but okay, yeah.
So
Sure.
relating evolution, you know, maybe this is outside of it, but the Big Bang Theory.
Right.
Okay, so.
What about the Big Bang Theory? The Big Bang Theory was actually started by a Jesuit, which already means it should be questioned. Anyway.
That's right.
There's two problems with the Big Bang Theory. The first is that they have actually plugged in all the courses of the current stars and traced them back, and they don't actually go to a singularity. They go to a particular, they can kind of end up in a general sizable and kind of clumsome groups in a general location, but they don't come to a singularity, which is the big thing. The second problem is, obviously, with the Big Bang is So just on a scientific level, there's problems. Right? The other thing is it's all based on particular presuppositions regarding redshift. And so all the redshift stuff is now being questioned and reanalyzed. And so what they're discovering is that even that's based on philosophical speculations about the nature of light, what redshift actually means, space and the contraction of space, etc. So there's several things that have gone into that discussion that they're now starting to realize that the theory behind redshift is not really answering the question, especially when they discovered that if you actually follow their theories of redshift, there's actual galaxies going faster than the speed of light on the edge of the universe. So that's a bit of a problem. So that's when they started realizing we've got the problem with redshift. Okay, so the point being is that the Big Bang Theory, which is heavily dependent on redshift, that it all would go converge back to a singularity, is unsustainable, at least at this time, by science. Obviously, you can't have, I mean, when Stephen Hawking said that the gap, when he said this, I just busted out laughing. He said, the gap between nothing and something is so infinitesimally small that it just jumped out. I'm like, what's this it you're talking about? There's nothing that exists, so it can't jump out, right? I mean, it's literally irrational. What he proposed was literally insane. I mean, it doesn't even make any sense. So, so the Big Bang, if the Big Bang did occur, it has to be done by God, but the idea that it had to be done over the course, and then after that, the development over billions of years is not necessarily the case either, because there's even some discussion about when the Big Bang first happened, all the physical laws are not necessarily in place, and so there can be massive expansion, at least at first, and then slowing down, etc. So the point being is that it's speculation, they don't really know much about it, and right now the science isn't backing it up, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Could you use one of the things that the Colby Center talks about is the dividing line between the supernatural order of creation and the natural order of providence?
That's right.
Is that something that you could maybe expound upon briefly to refute the Big Bang? Because Big Bang is kind of Descartesian in the sense that it says that natural processes, things have always been the same, so we can extrapolate back from now to see how a star, a supernova, was created.
Right.
But if you believe in the dividing line between the supernatural order of creation and the natural order of providence, you know that you can't do that.
Yeah, the natural order of providence is also the same thing as the doctrine of dependence. So it's just looked at from different points of view. So that's what it was kind of yeah, so in point and fact, there's the supernatural creation, and then there's just the process by which God governs the creation through and provides for it. So yeah, that's true. What's interesting is that some of the scientists are starting to realize that in the very beginning, the physical laws wouldn't have been the same anyway. At least if they're going to try and hold on to the Big Bang Theory, they've got to start morphing and warping the current physical laws to accommodate the theory. So either way, it's unlikely that things were the same, that they didn't actually begin the same. We actually know, or I should say, there's speculation that in point and fact, we know that the second law of thermodynamics was actually introduced as a result of original sin. That before the fall, there was not entropy. Things didn't degenerate. And it's only after that that's happened. It's interesting because the fathers of the church actually say that the star patterns actually were much more orderly, and that actually stuff just going awry and decaying and tending towards potency is actually more the product of the fall than anything else. Now, St. Thomas says that matter has a natural tendency towards potency, but before the fall, the forms that informed matter overcame that natural tendency, is what the fathers thought. And so that it's after the fall that the second law of thermodynamics was actually introduced, which would actually make some sense. Because it wouldn't make any sense that there would be entropy or genetic entropy even before the fall, because entropy affecting the genetics, because that means that Adam and Eve's kids would eventually mutate, right? Mutate in the sense of not becoming unhuman, but they'd suffer what we're suffering. We're getting less healthy, we're getting less, although sometimes I wonder if that's not our diet, but it has to do with the fact that we're genetically decaying, That wouldn't make any sense in the confines of the principle of the integral good as it's applied in the order of creation. So that means that the second law of thermodynamics would not have been introduced until after the fall, or at the fall, basically. Which makes you realize how impacting their sin was, the effect that it had. So, any other questions? No? Oh, okay.
I'm trying to think how to word this. My kids are always asking me, and I feel dumb not being able to answer it. Like, why are we all suffering from original sin from what they did? And I just sit there feeling stupid and I try to explain that to them.
Right.
Why we're all bearing the punishment of original sin.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually explainable with money. Okay. So let's say for the sake of argument, I give you $1 million. And you go blow your $1 million. You can't pass any of it on to your kids. Yeah. It's the same thing with this. God endowed human nature with sanctifying grace. His intention is that in the passing on, what we pass on in passing on of human nature is the state of that human nature at the time of the passing. So if Adam and Eve would have had children before the fall, they would have passed on the state of human nature before the fall, which would have been not fallen, and God would have infused grace at that time, because that's its state. After the fall, we're now in a different state. So they squandered this state that we had. They spent our money, so to speak. And so now the kids don't get any inheritance, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So, although, if Stephen Hawking is right, the $1 million should just jump out of your pocket. Yes.
I have a question now related to evolution. I'm originally from China, and I was grown up in China, and I worry about my mom. She's 84 years old, and as you know, raised and grew up in a communist country,
Right.
so did not know about God. So I'm kind of worried about her soul,
Right.
and also other folks, you know. So now she is 84 years old, getting there. So is there anything I can do, particularly pray for her, how to pray for her? So,
For her conversion, you mean, specifically, or?
very difficult. And she's been here twice, and I took her to a Catholic church, but I don't see that it will happen.
Right.
To me, possible. So I'm kind of worried.
Okay, there's two parts to the answer to the question. The first is that the Council of Orange defined that every man receives sufficient grace to be saved. So at some point in your life, in your mother's life, either in the past or sometime in the future, she will receive sufficient grace to accept God in sufficient manner to be saved. That's what the Council defined. Now, Pius thank you very much. Pius the Ninth said that we are forbidden, he condemned the proposition that we can have reasonable hope in the salvation of non-Catholics. Now, what does that mean? He didn't say we can't have any hope, because of this Council of Orange thing. God's going to give everybody sufficient grace. We also know that because of the fact that in the book of Revelation it said, and then after the 144,000, there was a throng, an innumerable throng of which there was people from every race and nation, right? Okay, so we know that people who may not have ever heard of Christ or something will be saved in some fashion. Now, obviously, it's done by means of the Catholic Church, because all grace comes into the world by the Catholic Church. Okay, that being said. So there is some hope for your mother, in some sense. The other component is this. In converting somebody, there's two parts. There's a negative and a positive. The positive part is you have to pray for her to receive the grace of conversion, and pray for her to accept whatever grace that God sends her. The second thing is you have to keep the demons out of her hair. Because what happens is the demons will play with people's emotions or their patterns of thinking in order to get them, or fear even, to get them to reject the graces that come. So if you say binding prayers against any demon that's keeping her from coming into the church or accepting the church, and then pray for her conversion. I've seen people convert parents who, on their deathbed, ended up accepting the church.
What I can do, you know, when she is dying,
Yeah.
what I can do for
If you in China.
Yeah, it will not happen here. I think she won't be able to come.
Here, right. If there's any way in which you can get a priest to her, obviously that would be the best, which is probably going to be very difficult.
Yes, so she's not Catholic.
Right. The other component would be is to simply ask, start praying now that God gives her the grace of that God gives her sufficient grace on her deathbed to accept.
I've been praying for her because there is a big division in the family, and she and my sister-in-law, we don't talk to each other. So I've been praying for her using your Bible prayer.
Right.
But I mean,
Oh, you got to keep doing it. You got to keep chiseling away at it. Some demons are bigger than others. But you, yeah. Partly, the other thing is Our Lady of Sorrows. Ask Our Lady of Sorrows to reveal. The reason you ask Our Lady of Sorrows is because when Our Lady and Saint Joseph took Christ to Saint Simeon said, "Your soul shall be pierced, so that the hearts of many will be laid bare." The fathers of the church say what that means is from that point on she became Our Lady of Sorrows, because Saint Simeon, in Scripture they would very often say he will become a sign of contradiction. So they would give him bits and pieces, but the Scripture would give a shorthand. But in point in fact, the fathers say that Saint Simeon actually told her in detail, this is what your son is going to go through, and detailed the crucifixion. So from that point on, she carried that knowledge with her whole time. But the fathers say that when she stood beneath the cross, she merited an intimacy with God as a result of that excelled every other human being's. And as a result of that, he reveals things to her internally about himself and his will and his plan to her that he won't reveal to anybody else. But he'll permit us to ask her and let her reveal it. So you can actually ask her under the title of Our Lady of Sorrows, reveal to my mother your son, Jesus Christ, ultimately. So that would be one of my recommendations, is pray, just keep asking Our Lady of Sorrows. Another thing is pray to Our Lady Undoer of Knots, because this is a bit of a knot, right? She can undo it. I've seen her undo some phenomenal knots, so she can do it. Okay. Yeah.
You've said that phrase twice now about keeping the demons out of our hair.
Yeah.
What is the best way we can do that as parents?
Well, the best way to probably do it as parents, in addition to saying binding prayers, is actually started saying the prayers of the group called Auxilium Christianorum, which was actually started by two exorcists. And basically what it is it's somewhere between 80 and 100,000 people saying the prayers for each other's protection. So literally, once you just start saying the prayers, you're enjoying the prayers of 80 to 100,000 people praying for your protection, not specifically, but as part of the group. And so a lot of times, family members have found that once they start praying, that a lot of the problems will kind of evaporate. The second component is if you start saying the prayers and things seem to get worse in the family, what that's really a sign is you've got a guy there and he's now reacting, right? So, and so that's fine. Then you ask Our Lady of Sorrows, reveal to me the nature of this thing so I can get rid of it. And then once she reveals what this thing is you're dealing with, then you can start saying binding prayers and have masses said and praying against them, working them out. The other thing is you might, in my experience, almost every single family has generational spirits. Those are spirits that somebody commits a sin, it gets introduced into the generational line, it gets passed. There's a particular set of mechanisms by which that happens, but it gets passed from generation to generation. And so asking Our Lady of Sorrows, reveal to me what is my husband's family generational spirit and what's mine. And that will give you a lot of times, you'll be able to see the dynamics. When she reveals it, she'll give you a grace to see clearly this is what the nature of the problem is, and then you can address it within your own family and pray and ask Our Lady and our Lord to remove it. So, but the other side of it is just asking Saint Michael to protect your family and asking Our Lady to protect your family on a regular basis. It's not just something you do once in a while. It's also, if you can get your husband doing it, that's even better. So, okay. Yes.
Is it dangerous to pray the auxilium prayers? If you aren't completely consistent with praying your rosary, I had prayed them for a while, and we were really good about praying our family rosary and everything. And I struggle a lot with fear, especially of the demonic. And I started to feel like if they saw me pick up the prayers, or they I was about to be attacked, and I was feeling like praying the rosary every day was like putting my shields up before praying. And then when I would falter on praying the rosary every day, I grew fearful of praying the auxilium prayers, and then everything kind of slid.
Okay.
So I don't know if I'm being driven too much by fear and I shouldn't worry so much about it.
Yes. Actually, Christ said, don't fear anybody except he can basically cast you in hell, which is God, right? The demons, you shouldn't fear them anyway because they can't get involved or do anything in your life unless Christ determines it completely. So that means that if they do get into your life, it's a mean that God wants something from you. He wants to purify you or help you to grow in some virtue. But and the other thing is too, is actually for the person who's praying regularly, the demons are more afraid of you than you are of them. And if they have to get involved with your life, it's because they're conscripted, they're drafted. God tells them, go deal with them, right? They have to do it. They have to tempt us. That's actually part of the whole thing of when Adam and Eve fell, God said to the serpent, because you have done this, you will crawl on the ground all the days of your life and eat dust. And the fathers ask, well, what's this dust? And they just respond, memento homo quia pulvis est. Remember, man, that thou art dust. So what it meant is that because he got us to fall, now his punishment is he has to work in tempting us and dealing with us. And the reason God allows that is for our sanctification and for our advance in virtue. So you shouldn't be afraid of them at all because he's got them on a very short leash. They can't do anything without him saying yes or no.
So if you pray the auxilium prayers and you're figuring you're going to do your rosary later and you don't end up praying your rosary,
yeah, that's fine. I mean,
let go of the fear.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't worry about it. I mean, the other thing is too is if you're worried about picking up the prayers, all you have to do is ask Christ and Our Lady to bind the demons from seeing the fact that you're doing that. Everything that you do is infused in their minds as it happens. However, us, I mean, I can be looking at this table and there's several things that are actually here, but I don't actually see the chocolate chip cookie unless I focus on the chocolate chip cookie. So it's the same thing with them. They have all this stuff infused in their mind, but they can't think about it unless they use their wills to turn towards it. But God can block their wills so that their intellect can't on that stuff, and that's how we blind them. So you can ask God blind them so they don't see that I'm saying in my prayers.
I wanted to mention that the Auxilium has a great app.
Yeah, which is just about to be updated. It's perfectly fine. There's one line that needs modification, but it's perfectly fine. Yeah, Auxilium Christianorum is a site. And we got 5 more. A question, maybe one more question? Yes.
So some masses said for generational sin. I don't know how you feel about those, but we're getting our tail kicked this year. Like, it's really very. So, what if you're really not smart enough to realize what is going on, and you're just trying to get up? Like, it feels like a barrage of. Right.
There's. Sometimes it can be retaliation, but usually it's not. My experience is that when people start doing that to start rooting out the generational spirits are particularly stubborn for some reason to get them out. What this means is the reason that he's attacking you is because it's working. He's feeling it. It's going to nearly kill us, though. So then what that means is in spiritual warfare, precision is everything. In exorcism, when someone's possessed, we spend literally sometimes months or years trying to get the one specific piece of information, one prayer, one thing that has to be done to break the possession. Okay. So what that means is in generational spirits, they're always of a specific nature. So that's why you pray to Our Lady of Sorrows. Reveal to me the nature of the generational spirit in my family. Once you know that spirit, then you can attack him directly, and all this other stuff will stop. Well, let's just say, for example, it's a demon of fear. Let's just take that. It's a very common one. Then basically what you do is you have to start working on confidence in God. You start saying binding prayers. You can actually go to a priest or an exorcist and say, could you say some minor exorcisms over us to break any spirit of fear? You also have masses said specifically for that intention, so that it's more specific instead of just kind of a general attack. work on the virtue of hope. So you work on the virtues contrary to it, you pray against it, you bind it, and then you have masses said for it. And then if you can get a priest to do the minor exorcisms, a lot of times that will help it to break. Once in a while, you might have to even ask Our Lady, okay, how do we get rid of this guy? So,
How does she tell you?
by simple grace, all of a sudden you'll just see it. Let me give you an example. There was a family, there was an exorcist actually, who actually, once he realized that generational spirits are practically in every family he was running across, he thought to himself, I wonder what's in my family. So he started saying the novena to Our Lady of Sorrows, and about 5 days in, he saw with clarity a problem that looked like it was across the board in his family, and it was a demon of fear. Low grade, subtle in the background. It didn't affect their ability to achieve anything. It didn't affect much. It affected their relationships because they were afraid of getting hurt, and so they would be difficult with each other, etc. But it was low grade in the background. Over the course of time, he started asking around, and he found out from one of his relatives that it actually had started from a particular ancestor. And so that this particular ancestor was put in a particular bad situation, and as a result of that, she became fearful, and then that's how it got in, and then it was passed on. Then he went and asked all his siblings and his parents, did you have a problem with fear? And all the siblings said, yeah, I've always suffered from fear, always. They had never talked about it. Nobody had ever kind of formalized it. And then the parents, the mother said, oh yeah, I've always suffered from fear. And the father said, I didn't have fear until I met your mother. So the point being is she'll give you a grace to see clearly, we've always suffered from this particular problem. See, the thing you have to remember with demons is the thing that you see most commonly is unlikely the nature of the demon. So like if you see a particular family has a real problem with chastity, it's probably not that. Demons are master tacticians. They know that if you drive something in one area, people will go and spend all their time wasting trying to get that taken care of while he's standing over here just lobbing the bombs. Even though he's kind of driving other things in the background, under the radar. Whereas, so in this particular case, once you find out, well, it's actually fear that's driving the problems with chastity, you start attacking the fear and working on confidence in God, and all of a sudden the chastity issues just evaporate, literally. So, but the point is you need to find out, as I mentioned, specificity is everything. What's the nature of this thing we're dealing with? Because then once you find out what it is, then you start, like as I mentioned, working on the virtues, praying against him, having masses said, and having the priests pray against it. And usually they're in for a haul. The only type of generational spirits that tend to break really rapidly are the ones that are connected to curses, such as Freemasonry or something. They tend to break pretty quickly. And so the demons kind of lose their force pretty quickly. But usually it takes a bit of doing to get them out. You have to remember also that God allows a particular demon into your family's life because he wants your family to attain a higher level of virtue in that area than other people's families necessarily, or in a way that other people don't. As I mentioned last night at my conference, God likes variety, right? So in heaven, everybody has different levels of virtue. The only one that has all the virtues and all the perfections other than Christ is Our Lady. Everyone else has varying degrees. So, and we know that God likes variety just because of the number of bugs he created. So, is that it?
What about the Ouija board affecting a family's?
Yeah. Actually, the Ouija board, you see it. It's kind of funny because one of the exorcists that trained me called it the devil in a box. You know, because you buy this box and it's got this little thing in it that introduces the devil into your family. But yeah, it can. I've never seen anybody become possessed through it, but it does actually. Usually, it'll start causing oppression where the family gets attacked in the relationships or outside or financially or things of that sort from it.
I just had a question about like the binding prayers. I've seen some of them in English and some of them in Latin. Now, I don't know when you do exorcisms if you use English or Latin. Does it matter? Is Latin more effective? And
Latin's more effective only because it's a sacred language. But usually what I tell lay people is just memorize the English version because you want to have something that you can readily use.
And then my other question is, demons, like when they say their names, are these names they give them themselves, or are these names that we are putting on them?
Under what context?
Just like Legion, or like, it seems like a lot of the demons are named like after this specific sin.
Oh yeah, that's true. Yeah, usually that's not their proper name. Sometimes they'll name themselves like, my name is fear, my name is anger, whatever, and that's because of the fact that that's what their primary thing is that they drive, or that this is what they're doing in this particular case. Demons actually have two names, one that was God-given, which is basically the same thing as their nature, because every demon has a different essence. And literally their personalities are far more distinct than ours. The difference between a grasshopper and a cow is literally how distinct their personalities are. The second thing is after they fell in mimicking and mocking God, and also to denigrate the other angels, Satan gave names to everybody in hell. And so usually when they tell their name, it's the one that's been given to them by Satan. You have to beat out their original name usually. So, okay, 2 minutes? Okay, yes.
Is it true or not true that the demons can read our minds or can't read our minds? I heard something to the effect that that's the only thing they have no power over, our minds.
They don't have access to what's in your mind. However, there's 3 ways they can know what you're thinking. The first is if they put a temptation in your mind and you're not offering resistance, they know what you're thinking because they're putting it there. The second, and the first time I came across that, realized that was, I was in session, there was a woman who was possessed, and she was kneeling down, and the demon had manifested, and he said, out of her mouth came, "You just think I'm nuts." Now, as those words were being said, "You just think I'm nuts," in my mind, he was putting in my mind, "She's just nuts," at the exact same time in which they were happening, right? So I'm like, oh, okay. So I know she's possessed now because that's preternatural knowledge, okay. But it also means that I realized they actually can know what's in your mind because of the fact that it's being put there by them. If you kick it out, then they don't know. The second way is by God revealing it, which is extraordinarily rare. In fact, the saints say God just doesn't do that to the demons, reveals what you're thinking. The other way is by the same way that we can kind of tell what people are thinking. Like, for example, when someone's lying, their eyes, around their eyes, the temperature goes up, and there's certain things that bodily disposition changes, people act particular ways. They also have been watching you from the time that you were born, and so they know your patterns of behavior, so they generally know what you're thinking when you're doing certain kinds of behavior, so they can kind of guess at what you're thinking, but it's pretty accurate. I mean, it's not 100%, but it's pretty accurate. And that's it. Okay. So if you want one more blessing, I'll give you another one. Benedictio Deum omnipotentis, Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, super vos et manet semper.